you see us growing out of silicon in the near future? Like, what's your kind of rundown on future computing substrates? Do you see
So
another, Moore's law continuing?
yeah, I mean, well, I'll say one thing. So first of all, I think I'm not that great at predicting the future. I feel like I've kind
That's a
of
great start.
yeah. So take everything I say and just kind of ignore it. No, but I mean, so actually, I remember when my first book came out. My first book was in 2012, and I remember
That
being
was
really
super complexity.
this is so it was the Half-Life of Facts.
Oh, the Half-Life
Yeah,
Max
the
is
Half-Life
first. Okay.
Facts. And so when that one came out, I was really glad that it came out in print because I was certain that like soon after that, every book was going to be electronic and there were going to be no print books after that. And of course, I was deeply wrong. And I feel like there's like other instances where I've just like totally missed it. And so I would say for me, there are some interesting hints that I've noticed in terms of like other substrates and things like that. So actually, one of the chapters I have in my book is about kind of the similarities and differences between computing and biology. Computing has binary, has zeros and ones, and biology is DNA, and it's like 4 base pairs. So it's like 4 instead of 2, and it's like very, very similar. And like, it turned out you can actually do some nice analogies. That being said, biology is also deeply different. Like it's much more stochastic and random. It deals in kind of like much more messy things as opposed to like computers are made in like chips are made in clean rooms. It's a very different kind of substrate. And some of the interesting areas that people are looking at are right now around, instead of thinking about biology as something wildly different, traditional computers and like the kind of computers we have like on our desks and things like that, that is a subset of this larger space of like information processing. And biology actually can show us all these other ways that we can compute and we can kind of do these kinds of things. And so, because like people, we always are drawn to metaphors, analogies of like, oh yeah, like the cell is a machine or a computer or whatever. Like it is, but it's also a wildly different computer than anything you would ever use to compute with. But because of that, it shows us how much broader computing can be. So, for example, like I mentioned, like harnessing randomness, that is like a very, very different way of operating. Or like, and people have actually used, I think, DNA to factor very large numbers or whatever into like their prime factors. There's also another idea of, I think the term is polycomputing, where by and large in computers, like we have, okay, here's a function, it does this specific thing. But in biology, you can have an enzyme that can do like, I don't know, 3 different things depending on like the level of the biological hierarchy that you're looking at. And so it's almost like overloaded, like this kind of like specific things, like doing lots of different things. And that is a wildly different thing than the kind of thing we're used to engineering. But it shows how much broader computing could potentially be. And so for me, I love looking at like that kind of thing to point to, oh, maybe we should expand the kinds of ways we should be building chips or hardware or software or whatever it is. But also you have, I mentioned earlier, of like analog computers, and analog computers, like for many people kind of view it as like, oh, they had their heyday back in the day and digital computers kind of usurped that. And like, that's where we're going to go. But it turns out that analog computers actually can still be potentially useful for certain kinds of things. And there are chips that are more analog-like, that are specific. I think they're essentially analog chips that are designed for doing the kinds of calculations that are necessary for large neural networks very, very rapidly. So it turns out that you could potentially be using analog computing for training AI systems and things like that. And so for me, I love kind of seeing those little hints of like, oh yeah, maybe some of these ideas that we kind of ignored for a while, but are now worthwhile kind of revisiting could be useful as well. So there's that, like there's kind of like also the space of like neuromorphic computing, of like kind of using ideas from biology to inform how we kind of compute with neurons and things like that. Obviously, there's things with quantum computing, which I think there's a lot of things that are moving forward in that. It still feels pretty early, but I'm excited that things are happening there. And going back to actually the history stuff, I actually think that in terms of actually figuring out the next steps of like where we can build, like where the future lies, we actually need to spend more time thinking about the history of computing, because oftentimes there's been a lot of like paths not taken or things that were tried and were kind of ignored because the technology wasn't right yet. But we should actually be revisiting that. And unfortunately, Silicon Valley especially is like particularly ignorant of technological history, and sometimes like proudly ignorant, which is really not good at all. And like there is something to be gained from learning about like even just like looking at like computer magazines from the 80s and 90s or even earlier, like just seeing what are the things that have been tried to try to kind of revisit that, as opposed to saying, oh no, like the newest thing is always better, I don't need to look behind us. Because sometimes actually the things that people made, they should be revisited and they should be looked at. And so whether it's analog computing or certain ideas that have kind of been fallen by the wayside or whatever it is, I think those are also really valuable in revisiting, both first things around, and maybe not for Moore's law, but also just for the kinds of ways we should think about in terms of like new paradigms for computing or interacting with our machines, or thinking about computational tools for thought or whatever it is. There's all these things that I think people have tried and are worth taking a look at.
The world of computing is, as you point out many times in the book, is like very broad, and we're seeing like very deeper and deeper specialization in types of compute and things that get built for specific outcomes in compute. Like the chip specialization, I think, is way broader than it ever has been before, which is cool. Something I've noticed is some of the very best investors are actually incredible historians.
Yeah, no, I
That's
think knowing, right, like knowing history is really valuable. And this is, and maybe I'm just partial to it because I find it really, really interesting. And I certainly included a lot of history in the book, partly because technology is moving so quickly that like I knew at least the history stuff was not going to be changing that much. And so I'll include more of that as opposed to like the most cutting edge thing. But I also really think that, yeah, understanding it deeply is really powerful, but also recognizing that a lot of the things we're thinking about now, like these questions are not new. I mentioned before that a lot of the applications and the way we think about computers, they were around essentially since like the modern era of the digital computer. Like we were trying all these things and it took a long time for some of these ideas to kind of reach fruition, but they're not new. And so like when you think about, especially like with AI, like people talking about issues around the alignment problem or unanticipated consequences or how we think about how it will change the nature of work and meaning. These things are not new. So Norbert Wiener, the developer of cybernetics, he has this, I think it was like it's in a collection of essays that I think it was based on a lecture series called God and Golem Incorporated. It's a very thin book. And he talks about all these topics. And the truth is, not only was it like kind of in this weird, obscure thing where he was talking about like by the founder of cybernetics, but it was also in popular culture. So like around that same time, in like the mid to late 1960s, there was an episode of the original Star Trek called, I think it was called The Ultimate Computer. And it was about this like super powerful computer like being tested to like, control the Enterprise and doing other things. And they talked about every topic we're talking about now. Like I remember watching that episode and just being blown away by how obviously it's dated in many, many ways, but also how perennially relevant all the things they're talking about were. And so I really do think that there's something to be gained, by looking at like how people talked about these things, how they thought about what they would do and how they would change society, and just like all that history I think is so powerful and valuable.